saying, of course, with Christmas coming up, we are going to be focusing our spot checks on transport and logistics.
Yeah.
So in that area, just beware that they might come and pay you a visit.
And those in construction obviously know that they've always been on the radar for the HSE, so it's nothing new there then.
No, so you've got construction and manufacturing. There's a they'll still be on the radar, but logistics.
Alan, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to flag up a question. It's interesting. I think, Kizzy, you said you'd you'd had 3 cases, I think, come through to you from concerned employees. I haven't seen any figures and analysis of what how many complaints HSE has followed up. That's going to be quite interesting. And it's a very different picture to one of our previous speakers, Dan Shears from the GMB Union, when he was talking about, daily fielding dozens of concerns. And some of those were passed on to HSE and others were resolved directly. I think we need to tease that out a bit.
Well, it'll be interesting. I think maybe those figures will become public at some point. I think the unions are going to do what they can to ensure that happens. I know that, for example, the TUC had said the HSE are not doing enough. They're not doing enough to ensure that businesses are following up on some of these complaints and actually doing more for those that are in breach of the regulations. So they're trying to push for much more interaction or at least proactive action from the HSE. And I think there has been, but you've got to think about the HSE and their resource issue and the fact that they have got to focus on lots of things, health and safety, and not just COVID. So it's a difficult balance. We know that this is time is of the essence, and obviously they should be focusing on COVID related, but yeah, the trade unions they weren't happy, and I think they're probably still not that happy with the amount of action that the HSE are taking in relation to complaints from employees. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think I think we all sort of focused on the fact that the HSE got a 15 million or whatever it was cash injection to help them deal with COVID, but they're still, I think, even with that top up this year, they're still behind on what their budget would have been 10 years ago, I think, in 2010. So I think they're still, even though in our minds we might think they've got a lot more resource, but it's not like me, a defence lawyer, to stick up for the HSE. But
I never do.
massively under-resourced, and to think of, I can't imagine what their to-do list is like and what, where they go next. And they've got, we saw the terrible things that happened down in Avonmouth this week. They've got, the I don't want to say the normal health and safety, but they've got that, that kind of thing to deal with as well. So their pre-COVID workload plus this, and I feel like that budget is just not going to stretch very far at all.
It's difficult.
And I think a lot of staff, say in the sectors as well, that might have been given sector-specific advice, have been drawn into helping out in the broader picture as well. So they've been strained both frontline and back office, if my colleagues, ex-colleagues, have pardoned that expression.
I did see today that the HSE are advertising for their head of legal. So obviously,
sorry.
Prosecution. So I thought somebody's obviously had enough, and I thought that's it. Someone else could deal with it. I'm going to be
2 potential applicants with us tonight.
No thanks. I'm quite happy fighting the good fight for those that are trying to comply with health and safety.
Yeah.
Melissa, our chair, she's been studiously we've had so many questions. It's amazing. We could go on all day.
I'll tell you what we might do, because I know time is ticking, and I know that people probably do have some questions. Maybe we can do like what I do with the likes of IOSH and SHP, is maybe we can take some of those key questions and we can do a kind of feedback, or put it in one of the IOSH bulletins or something, where we can address some of those things that I think everybody would probably want. We will capture them all, and in fact the whole thing will, as I said, there'll be the recorded thing as well. Melissa, what have you put together there?
Yeah, there's 2 questions. Yeah, there's been loads of questions, so thanks, Kizzy, if we'll be able to follow up with them and post them. But 2 I wanted to raise here. let's just pull it back up there. So Keith Foster asked, since HSE say C19 transmission at work is RIDDOR reportable, if the arrangements are found to be lacking and the person subsequently dies, could that be investigated as corporate manslaughter? So that's one question. And then the other one, Julie asked, and I thought this is an applicable one. It's really about if an employee notifies the company of being COVID positive within 72 hours of visiting the site, you know, does the site do something or wait for the track and trace to do that notification?
Right, short answer to the first one. The answer is yes, because we've had one. I've had one with a client who had an employee who contracted the virus and it wasn't reported. In fact, the question to me was, should they report? And in between the time of deciding whether or not they should report or not, the person died. They did report, and the HSE then investigated, and it was for two things, which they often do. They figure out whether or not there's been a breach of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is the kind of general view that we spoke about earlier, and also whether or not it would constitute a corporate manslaughter issue, which is a corporate offence, not individual. It's whether or not the senior members of management and of the business have somehow, in their ability to organise and manage activities for the business, that has contributed, or it's been a cause of the death. They owe a duty of care to this person, and it's caused or contributed to the death of that person. Very easy for them to link it. It always has been. It just happens to be COVID, but it is something that the HSE would look at if there has been a fatality, as to whether or not this is a corporate manslaughter offence or is it not. So yes, short answer, yes. I forgot the other question now.
The other question was around if an employee notifies an employer of being suspected for COVID, does the site do notifications or wait for the track and trace?
No, my view would be the obligation is to do what's reasonable in the circumstances. If you are aware that someone has contracted the virus, I'd figure out who they've come into contact with, and I'd be putting things in place immediately. I wouldn't be waiting for track and trace systems to be kicking in. It would be, if it's like schools. Look, I've got my daughter who has come into contact with a class where there is a positive there's been a positive test, in fact 2 positive tests. The precaution that the school have taken is actually they've sent both classes home. It's a 2 form school. They sent both classes home, and they've already got in place home working systems, so they're all working on Google Classrooms. They could wait to see if people are testing positive who have come into contact with that second class, but no, they've taken the proactive step, because they've got those measures already in place, to make sure that everyone in that year has been sent home, so that there's a less likely a chance to contract the virus or to spread the virus. It's all about mitigating the transmission of the virus. And if there are things that you can put in place reasonably now without waiting for a track and trace system to inform you how to do this, then I'd be saying that's what the HSE are looking for. They want you to take all reasonably practicable steps. That might be track and trace, but it also might be putting in place measures where you encourage people to do home working or some other measures. So I wouldn't be waiting. I wouldn't be waiting.
No, and I agree with entirely with what Kizzy says there. But also one thing to add in terms of businesses and what they're doing, in addition to track and trace. I know that some people have got systems in their workplace where they have effectively a track and trace system in their workplace, where people have to log when they've come in, who they've come into contact with. It might be over the top for some businesses, but I know some businesses are doing that, so that if this happens, they can work out who people have come into contact with pretty easily. Steps. And yeah, I certainly wouldn't be waiting around for track and trace, because that's an absolute opening for criticism if you know something but stepping back and waiting for track and trace to do something. No.
There's a couple of people have flagged up that obviously we haven't got onto fire. I mean, the discussion.
I know. I'm sorry. No,
but I mean, in a way, it's what I expected.
I knew we do. We'd end up talking about this stuff, and then people would be really interested.
We have anticipated it in that early in the new year we will be revisiting that. But any quick thoughts?
I can deal with workplace mental health and wellbeing relatively quickly, because a lot of the stuff is there, and then maybe we can focus our last sort of 15 minutes or so on fire. But all I would really want to highlight for mental health and wellbeing, because there's so much out there on it, some of it COVID related, some have not, because we've been doing a lot on wellbeing and mental health for a few years now. The thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that the HSE have got guidance out on investigating cases related to work-related stress. In fact, they had that from last year. And I had always said it's only a matter of time before they start prosecuting on the basis of work-related stress issues, despite it being quite difficult to find a causal link between the stress and an incident occurring. What the HSE themselves had actually said is that if they can determine that a number of staff have experienced work-related stress or ill health as a result of their work activities, then actually they will actively investigate and prosecute where necessary. So I think whereas before there wasn't a lot of focus on occupational health or work-related stress, which is often seen as the softer side of health and safety, the HSE are now proactively stepping up and saying, look, if you're not managing work-related stress within your workplaces, or you've got people who have complained about suffering from depression or anxiety and it's not being managed in the right way, and that may have contributed to an incident at the workplace, then they will proactively prosecute for that. So I think it's something definitely to look out for and to take on board. Some of the things that people have talked about in terms of managing work-related stress issues, I'll just list them for you so that you've got them. We'll be looking at regular catch-ups, particularly as we're some of us are working from home, regular catch-ups with employees, both junior and senior, refresher training for people so that they feel like they're keeping up to date with the tasks and the ability to do the work that they're meant to do, making sure that support is available for employees, whether that be kind of employee assistance programs or independent programs, encouraging people to actually take some time off, which is one thing that I could probably learn from. You know, even if you're working at home, I think Alison alluded to it at the beginning, is that some of us are working probably harder than we used to when we were in an office. So it's looking at, you know, how are we managing that, and are we taking enough time out, whether it's breaks during the day or in fact annual leave, and also being compassionate to people who have been severely affected by COVID, i.e. losing people, or the impact of working at home on their own. It's a very different ball game for a lot of them. So I think it's worth looking at some of those cases, those situations. I've put the case of Renown up because there were issues around looking at them as a business where they were prosecuted for a specific failure to manage workplace fatigue, and as a result they didn't enforce fatigue policies, and it resulted in an serious incident that they were prosecuted for. So again, in the links, or perhaps at a later date, I can forward you a link to the case, which is quite interesting reading. It links to a couple of other cases that are similar, where the companies are being prosecuted on the basis of failing to ensure that occupational health or work-related stress issues are being dealt with in the workplace, and it then results in an incident. So that's kind of my summary on mental health and well-being. Alison, were there other things you wanted to add?
Yeah, there was just two things, I think. The first thing I think I wanted to comment on is about workplace stress and suicide, because you know, I think it's come to the fore more often and more recently, and people are talking about it more, and I'm pleased that they're talking about it in schools and in workplaces, but there's still, you know, some stigma attached to that. But you know, if somebody does take their own life, and sadly take their own life, then there will be an inquest, and that coroner will look at the circumstances relating to that person's death. And if you know, he or she will be asking questions you know, about that person's life and their employment, and of course in that context there might be questions raised about you know, the stress they're under at work, their pressure. You know, you do see you know, I've seen, you know, plenty of inquests where, you know, people have been in high pressure jobs and taken their own lives, and the coroners certainly delve quite deeply into those issues. And the second point I thought I would raise, in addition to the point you talked about, Kizzy, about, you know, the HSE looking at, you know, whether they were going to pursue prosecutions in relation to stress and such like. Of course, it kind of reminded me when I was looking at that case that you mentioned there, that we have this quite an old case now from 2008, Core versus I think it's IBC, which is the case where an individual suffered a really quite horrific injury in the workplace, and was disfigured, and has suffered an injury to his head, and that led to depression, and sadly in the end that person took his own life. And that there's a case that when the wife, the guy had actually started a case against his employer for damages, obviously to compensate for his injuries, and his wife tried to take over that case, and the question was whether she could actually pursue the case in relation to his suicide, and the House, it went right to the House of Lords as it was at the time, and they said yes, you will be liable if suicide is a reasonably foreseeable consequence of that stress. So I think as well as looking at the HSE side, there's also that liability side to it all as well.
There's a couple of questions sort of come up overlapping in relation to consultation, and Richard, where are we? Richard Heath, he picked up, why we're still talking about risk assessments being done by the health and safety manager or departmental head and not involving staff. But I think that goes without saying. You both mentioned the importance of collaboration involving staff, and that's what we would always say. It is about consultation, but just picking up on perhaps on some of the elements you were just talking about then, but flipping back to COVID as well. We've got Karen White, who's had the pleasure of HSE's company on one of her sites, just to give her personal experience, and sure. Karen's willing to share that with us. I think that'd be helpful and interesting.
Sure.
Karen.
Hi, yes. Sorry, my video is not working, so I can't share that. But yeah, I just put a note out to say we've had 2 visits from the HSE. I work for an electronics company. We've got about 40 sites globally, but particularly in the UK, we've had 2 visits, as you mentioned, in the north. One very positive. Actually, it was a result of a contract company that was on one of our sites doing some CDM work, who actually reported to Riddle wrongly for a positive COVID that wasn't needed, but they actually contacted us initially, which we've had on 2 of our sites, just to ask for follow-up information. And as you've mentioned, asking about our approach, risk management, all of the things you've touched on, training. And then obviously came and did an unannounced visit to really look at a follow-up from the track and trace aspect that wasn't related to a cluster, but just an individual report. And it was very positive. What I would say is they did very much focus on looking at, as usual, the physical controls, the social distancing. They wanted to speak to the union representatives and understand, as we've touched on, the training aspect and what employees understood and how that was perceived, which was positive. But also, I think there was an acknowledgement, because we implement a positive follow-up investigation, whereby if we have a positive test employee, we follow up and make sure there's not be any contact on us. That we're a manufacturing business, so it's important that we understand if there has been an accidental with a 2-meter distance. And what we do is exactly that. We investigate and we send people home proactively, which hence in this case they came on to. We sent all of our contract CDM workers home from one positive person that came in and did the right thing, reported it to the contract, and they reported it to us. And that was very positively received. So no follow-up, just thanked us.
Perfect.
And one thing just to note we have seen recently as well is I've had a lot of environmental health officers contacting some of our sites in more the high risk areas, and whether, I don't know if others have seen this, but they're reaching out to organisations just to say, would we work with them, because they obviously are struggling with some of the track and trace data and keeping up to date, and asking that when we get positive employee cases reported to us, would we mind working with them to just so they can validate their track and trace data in those extremely high risk areas. Wales is one of those areas at the moment, so that they can proactively check and act accordingly. So I don't know if anybody else has seen that, but certainly that's something new in the last week, so I thought worth a mention.
Thank you, Karen.
Interesting.
Just while we're finishing off, I'll relaunch that. I'll launch that last poll. I don't know if that's on the screen now. Continue. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay.
That's it.
So please, we've still got around 110 with us. Some people are obviously starting to flag after a long day as well.
And we appreciate it. We do appreciate it. This was our attempt to try and see, you know, how do people prioritize in terms of how do we address potential mental well-being issues in the workplace. What's the best way to do it?
While people are filling that in, I mean, you know, I won't say it's raised as many questions, but it's raised some good thoughts for people to go away. I think this is one of those, it needs watching again, and those who've had to leave for various reasons, will encourage them to look at, you know, part 2, as it were, right to the end. Melissa, is there anything else that you've teased out in particular? I'm thinking we should make 9 o'clock as the witching hour today, because you guys have put so much into this for us, as well as those that have joined us.
Melissa there?
Yeah,
Oh, she's muted.
yes. So there were some questions early on that I think ties back well to this piece we were talking about with mental health. So someone asked around like a division between employees who are furloughed versus those who have not. Would it increase a gap between office workers, non-office workers? So I think those touch on the, you know, this theme that you were just talking about around mental health and, you know, staying in contact with employees, etc. But I don't know if you wanted to add any more to those 2 questions that were asked early on.
I think the fact that the poll results have shown that the priority for business is, as far as our attendees are suggesting, is that there should be more interaction between employers and employees, and how you do that is really up to you, but it is about the engagement, whether you're on furlough or not. Those on furlough want to feel included just as much as those who are actively working. So it's about how are you managing your communication with those who are on furlough, and those that are not on furlough, and keeping everybody part of a team. I take a lot of these buzzwords, Alan's mentioned a couple of them already, from the construction sector, who talk a lot about collaboration, communication, cooperation and engagement. And I think that's really, really important and applies to a lot of different sectors. If you get that bit right at the beginning, you'll have less of an issue moving forward. And it certainly is about making sure that everyone's working together, because everybody has their own obligations, both individually and as part of a business. So I think that's key. The fact that that's the top priority, and people mean that people will recognise that. They do recognise.
Yeah, and I think for the, you know, for the people who are on furlough, as you say, Kizzy, they don't want to be forgotten. And it kind of made me think back to when I was on maternity leave, and you have to keep in touch days just to make sure you're still in touch with the business and you're still included. You know, have you invited that person to the Christmas party? Have you remembered to send them their yearly evaluation? And have, you know, they're not forgotten, they're still an employee. And I certainly valued still feeling part of the team and being, you know, invited to take part in, you know, meetings as what's happening with the business and such, like, to the extent that, you know, that clearly wasn't encroaching on my time off, but you know, to take that away. And just also another thought, and I think I've mentioned it in previous you know, meetings that we've had. I did a session on mental health, I think it may be 2 years ago now. We talked about the HSE's labour force survey, which looks at you know, trends and statistics in workplace stress and anxiety and depression, and looks at the different sectors and how they're affected in the different age groups and such like. And that report came out in November this year, and actually it was from the time period which it covers is March 2019 to March 2020, so kind of only clips the beginning of COVID, and that saw a real significant increase in the number of people suffering from workplace stress and anxiety. You know, over nearly, I think it was over 300,000 new people within the year. So I cannot imagine what that's going to say next year. But I thought the interesting thing to take away from that was that, yeah, within that survey, it asked, you know, what are the 3 things that you know, are contributing most to your stress and anxiety? And let me have a look. One of them was tight deadlines. The second one was too much responsibility. But the one that we're talking about here is lack of managerial support. And that kind of, I think that comes into, you know, our answer here the first poll, you know, people want to feel supported, and being at home, people can feel very isolated, you know, sitting in front of their, you know, their desk or whatever, you know, with their emails, and, you know, they might not to speak to someone all day and just feel very isolated and have no one to, you know, get up and have a cup of coffee with and, you know, chat through to and such like. And you know, that interaction, I think, is really, really important. And I think it's really important that people don't push it off because they think other things are important. You know, I've got a meeting, I can't do your call now. You know, make those calls, make it, you know, your business to reach out to people, not just about asking them to do things for you, but actually asking them about, you know, how they are. And, you know, some people don't want to talk about those things, but, you know, just to have that social call with people to make sure they're okay, and have all the.
I know, Alan, I know we've got to go. I know for those people that are probably logged on to talk about fire safety, I promise we will cover it. I've put the slide up only because I wanted those that were really interested in fire safety to kind of pick up on some of the things that I thought were quite important, so that when we do talk about them, they'll already have an idea of what
we'll do, Kizzy. We're scheduling our program for next year, and as we've seen, we can run them fortnightly or monthly or whatever. But we're planning a session on fire and buildings in February.
Hopefully, so we'll know a bit more about what's going to happen.
You two guys will be top of our list to invite.
As we said, we had a lot of interest in this event, and nearly 500 people registered. And so I know they will be looking at the recording. And then we had nearly 140 people attend. Great conversation, great comments, chat, and questions. So thanks again for the offer to follow up with answering the questions that we may not have been able to answer. But thanks very much, everyone, for attending. And you're all welcome to join our Christmas social next week, Saturday.